Thanks, Dottie. Welcome everybody on Zoom and on Facebook. Thanks for joining me for this initial go round where I figured we could talk about migration forecasting and just the unbelievable, amazing things that ornithologists can do now with that and how it impacts not only our bird watching, but the conservation work that we're doing at Georgia Audubon and that many others are doing across the Audubon network and elsewhere. I borrowed this idea from a colleague of mine out in the Rocky Mountain region. He works for Audubon Rockies. And he said, oh yeah, we did a live lights out alert to talk people through what are these alerts, what's going on, what does an alert mean? And we had another exciting kind of stakeholder meeting talking about this mapping. And it seemed like such a cool idea and something I hadn't thought of, and I stole it. And I think he's okay with that. But yeah, I was going to do something real flashy and dress up like a weatherman, and I just wasn't creative enough and didn't have enough time. So I went back to my PowerPoint crutch. So I'm going to show you some slides, and then we're going to look at some websites, and I would really love questions and any sort of interaction. So please, cool birds you've been seeing, questions, if anything isn't clear, chime in, and let's do this. Let's talk about migration. So right now is arguably the most exciting time of the birding calendar throughout Georgia. We have our resident birds are nesting. We have all sorts of winter birds that are just barely or hanging on in the state. They're moving up to the North Georgia mountains, but the migrants are coming through. And not only are they coming through, but they're in all their glory. So if you're out by a swampy area, you might find northern water thrush that maybe just came back from Costa Rica. Yellow-billed cuckoos are streaming across the Gulf. You know, these birds go very far south into South America, one of the most long distance or well-traveled of our kind of passerine songbird type birds that are going way down to Paraguay and Bolivia and cool places like that. And they're coming back. Showstoppers like the summer tanager, some of them might be back on territory if you have a nice patch of pines and you live down in the coastal plain. And others are just now making their way back through. So it's just such an exciting time of year. There's so much bird song. There's so much unknown. You don't know what's going to pop up. And it's a great time to get out. And to kind of put this in perspective or to give you some numbers, this is from a few years ago. This came out, and this ties in a lot to what I'm going to be talking about, where they could really they could quantify the number of migrants that are coming in and out of our country. So this time of year, around our southern border and down into Florida, 3.5 billion birds, plus or minus one or two, are entering our country. And so think about all those birds that manage to make it through the winter months down in, Jamaica or Oaxaca or, Peru, and they're coming back to breed. And many of them are just going to pass right through, and they're going to go up to the boreal forests or up to the Arctic. Some of the birds that we've had this winter, white-throated sparrows, dark-eyed juncos, yellow-rumped warblers, they're going to go up all the way there as well. So a billion birds stay here, and that's not quite how the math works, but 3 billion come in, 2.6 go out. And it's just such a phenomenal time. And you can see in the fall, more are leaving, and that's because you have all the youngins that have made it out of the nest that are heading down south. And we're pretty privileged here in Georgia that we get migration in a few different ways, a few different flavors of spring migration. So because of where we're situated, we get a lot of birds that are coming back now from the Caribbean. They've been down in Cuba, they've been in the Bahamas, and they're gonna kind of island hop, and they're gonna hit Florida, and they're gonna come up through the peninsula and right into Georgia. And so if you do bird a lot in the state, there are certain species that are just a lot more common on the coast. Yellow warbler, black-throated blue warbler. You can get those anywhere, but they're pretty numerous down there, and it makes sense. They're kind of hugging the coast on their way back north. Some birds are a little afraid of the water, maybe a Nashville warbler or some of the other warblers, and they hug Mexico. But you can kind of see, if you can see my cursor, one of these lime green lines, it shoots across and it lines up perfectly where I live at Kennesaw Mountain, which is a fantastic warbler hotspot, migrant hotspot. And some of those birds that are a bit tricky in Georgia hit that northwest corner, and that's where we see them. And then many of our birds are these trans-Gulf migrants. They double their weight, they shift their organs around to store fat, and they do this nonstop journey across the Gulf of Mexico. and they might hit, Dauphin Island or St. George, or they might make it all the way up to the North Georgia mountains before they touch land. So we get all three kind of routes coming through our state. And so it's a fantastic time the next, 3-4 weeks to get out and look for some of these birds while they're on their journey. And, how birds migrate is amazing and tricky and confusing. And we know bits and pieces. We know that birds can quote unquote see the Earth's magnetic field. They can tap into that to help guide them on their way. They're, of course, looking for geographic landmarks, whether it be a mountain range or the coastline or other features that they can pick up on. They can smell their way in some cases, olfactory cues as they go. But a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight kind of taps into this idea that they use the setting sun and they use the stars and nocturnal light in many ways to guide their journeys for better or for worse in our new developed world compared to how long these birds have been doing these journeys. And so wouldn't it be cool? We have all these birds, they're coming from all over the place. It's so dynamic and the wind might help them, it might hurt them. How are birds impacted by storms? Wouldn't it be neat if we can forecast when these birds are going to show up? It's nothing's worse than on a beautiful spring morning, you go to your patch, lo and behold, there's just no songbirds there. It's a bit of a dud. I mean, hopefully you still have a good time looking at the cardinals and the Carolina wrens, but man, where are those blackpoll warblers that you're hoping for? And luckily, we can now do that, the collective we, with some of our forecasting capabilities. And that's kind of what I'm going to focus on for most of our talk here. And again, how you can learn more about this and use it to your advantage for bird watching and for conservation. That's kind of what I'm going to focus on for most of. Dottie, if that's you, you're not muted. I'm guessing you're the only one I can hear, and I get to hear my own horrible voice in the background. All right, so with that forecasting, the way we do it is the same way we do it with our weather, more or less, is we use radar technology. And so super brief background on radar. It was around or tweaked for a couple hundred years in the 19th and 20th centuries, but it really became a practical tool around World War II. It would be used to pick up aircrafts that were moving around. And our military and other militaries realized, man, there's all this radar noise that we keep getting from storm fronts, from rain or sleet or snow or clouds, whatever it might be. And so that logically led to the next practical use once the war was over. And that was kind of the birth or the origins of using radar for weather fronts and storms and making predictions there. In addition to the noise from the weather, the way we use it now, there were these things, there were angels and ghosts and these unexplained things that kept popping up on the radar. And it took a while, and there was some theorizing, but it was confirmed in the 50s, at least scientifically, that those ghosts were actually birds or flocks of birds that were being picked up by radar. And so now there's a whole new, frontier of learning about how radar could help with birds. And not much happened for decades. And in the past 20 to 30 years, it's really picked up on how weather radar, and especially our newer NexRad radar, can be used for avian research. And so the concept's pretty similar, and I'm no radar expert, so I'm not going to act like I can tell you all the details on that, but more or less just as you can with precipitation, the signal's put out there, it hits off the bird, and it gives you a signal and the density if there's a nice flock going by. The radar can also pick up bat migration and insects. And so there's different frequencies, there's different movement, there's different predictions that can be made based off the signals that are out there. And that's how we can tease out when birds are moving overhead and now in what quantities and what direction they're going, at what time and what speed, just all sorts of phenomenal things using NexRad radar. My very first paid bird job back when I was a young college student was working with purple martins. And I remember back then, that was 2005. It was so exciting because we could pick up martin roosts when they were leaving in the morning. So purple martins nest in man-made cavities in the eastern US, and the males can't fit in those cavities. So they have a guy's night every night, and they hang out somewhere over a marsh or under a bridge or somewhere safe. And then as the young fledge, they and the females will join the males, and purple martins have these large, sizable roosts. New Orleans has a couple, the Outer Banks, Nashville, all sorts of places. So this is kind of showing you how we can pick up birds as they're leaving where they've been sleeping all night, first thing in the morning. That's why they're kind of going out in a circle as the birds disperse in different areas. And again, to do all this, we're using our NexRad radar stations. And this is where they are located across the country. I think there's 130 some, 140, relatively equally distributed, but less so in the West for a few reasons. The topography, the mountains are part of the issue, and that's going to play into what I'm going to be showing in future slides. But this is where these stations are, and they can pick up our larger masses of birds that are moving. And so here is kind of those things all coming together. So the white dots are where those NexRad radar stations are. As you're used to seeing the greens and the reds and the yellow, that's the typical precipitation. That's how you normally see storm fronts moving over when you're trying to plan your picnic on the weekend. But those pulses of blue are birds. And this is on one night. It's kind of showing you how the birds move throughout that time frame. But you can see how we can tease out what's bird movement, what's thunderstorms, and what might be something else. So pretty amazing. This is kind of a rough show of how these birds can be picked up as they move over a given space. Here's the same type of graphic, but over a couple days, maybe a bit faster paced. Again, showing you these pulses of movement. You can kind of see how it changes over each day, maybe a little bit in the center of the country, and then more of an eastern bias. You can see California's popping off on a couple of those days. So again, our storm fronts are moving, and then bam, look at those birds migrating overhead in huge numbers. Now, what you might not know, so okay, birds are migrating, there's billions of them, you know that. You go out and look for American redstarts and rose-breasted grosbeaks and yellow-billed cuckoos. But what might be news to you is that the vast majority of these birds, especially the songbirds, are migrating at night. So that's kind of what I mentioned earlier. They're using the sun, the stars, as one of the ways they can guide themselves as they're heading north in the spring and south in the fall. And so all of that radar, much of that radar I just showed you, the technology is actually tracking birds that are flying over our heads while we sleep and get excited to go bird watching the following morning. And so on any given night, or not any given night, on a nice spring migration night or a good busy fall night, there could be millions of birds overhead. These birds normally start taking off shortly after sunset. It kind of peaks a few hours after it gets dark. And then, as I mentioned earlier, these birds are often waiting for the right conditions, and they're waiting for that tailwind. You know, they're no dummies. They're waiting for a nice, easy ride. So if you're down in Cancun right now and you're a magnolia warbler, you're not going to fly into a headwind for days as you try to cross the Gulf of Mexico. You're going to wait for those warm southern winds to push you across the Gulf. And that's why oftentimes these big pushes of birds over our areas are on days where it starts to warm up. You know, the winds are coming out of the south. These birds can do short flights. They can do, you know, just barely getting across the Gulf and stopping, which is why High Island, Texas, and Dauphin Island, Alabama are famous for spring migration. Or they can just keep shooting over and go for, you know, tens and tens of hours, up to 100 hours, and just unbelievable distances. You know, songbirds, maybe a bit less so. Some of our shorebirds like godwits are doing these, you know, crazy multi-day flights over miles and miles of the ocean. So these birds are doing fantastic things at night while we're doing it. The altitude might vary depending on what's going on, the weather conditions, cloud cover. And they're doing so at night because, you know, the thermals aren't out there. The air is a little bit calmer, easier to fly in. It's a bit cooler. You know, birds run hot. They have a high metabolism, so they're going for those cooler nights. There might be less predators, you know, less hawks out there. You know, your neighbor's outdoor cat is not going to be out there to catch it when it lands. And oftentimes they can also time it with a diurnal, a daytime landing. So amazing stuff is happening, and it's happening at night. And here, kind of building off some of those images I showed you earlier, is depicting that. So here are our radar stations in green, or the active ones. Red are inactive, at least at that time. This horizontal, or excuse me, diagonal red line is indicating sunset. And you can see shortly after sunset, these birds are starting to take off down in the southeastern region. So there is some movement throughout the rest of the country, and some movement even southward. Maybe the winds are pushing some of the birds there. But here's a nice spring night in May where those birds in the southeast are taking off. So that's what we know a little bit about radar. So radar can pick up birds. Birds are moving at night. They're doing so in spring. How can we forecast this? What does this look like? And how can you interpret those forecasts? Well, there it is. There's Adam, bird weatherman, here to tell you a little bit about what's going on. This is my poor attempt at doing something silly and humorous. The birds should actually probably be on the other side of the front, but that's okay. So what does the forecast look like the next 2 nights, and how can we interpret what's going on here? Now, I'm going to show you some images, and then we'll play around on the website, and I'll show you some more options. So when my colleagues and I picked this night, I just said, hey, there's got to be a couple good nights of migration around this last week of April. It's got to be good. And we looked out that it is pretty good. So here is the migration forecast for our country tonight. 258 million birds are going to be in the air tonight as we sleep. And you can see it's a decent night down here in Georgia. It's a bigger night in the central part of the country. Texas is often hot with spring migration, birds using the central flyway there. Some action down in southwest Arizona, up in the Pacific Northwest. So the way you can interpret this map, the hotter white the color, so bright white, bright yellows, those are high intensity migration, lots of birds. Then in the gray scale, so like kind of over, western Oklahoma, up here in Montana, those are precipitation, likely rain. The darker gray, the more severe or more likely the severity of that storm front. So it looks like here we're getting a nice push of birds right in front of that front, and then maybe a little bit slower behind it. So if you're thinking about this from a bird watching standpoint, this is a great mix. So if you're up there in the middle of the country, if you're up there in Missouri, for example, if these birds are migrating and that storm front hits in the middle of the night, that might cause a fallout. It's going to knock those birds down. The smooth airway is no longer there. They're going to take a break. And so that's a great time to think about getting out and going birding when something like that happens. How about the next night? So 258 million, Adam, that's got to be the craziest day all spring. Well, no, not at all. The next night, we're getting even more birds and even better down here in our part of the world. So 310 birds on the night of the 28th will be migrating. You can see things have cooled down up there in Missouri. I just referenced that. Those birds, so to step back, I failed to mention this. These colors, this projected movement is 3 hours after sunset. And just because that area is bright white or yellow, it doesn't necessarily mean those birds will be on the ground. Those are birds overhead. If the conditions are great, all those Texas birds, they might not stop until they hit Kansas and Nebraska and Missouri when they're reaching the rain, because that actually makes them stop. So sometimes it can be a bit tricky where you're thinking, okay, down here in East Texas, it's got to be the best birding day of the spring. Not necessarily, because again, these are birds that are overhead in the middle of the night. It often works out that it could be good birding, but it's not always the case. But again, right at the southern edge of these storm fronts could be especially good if the birds are stopped there because of it, and then they're held there for a little while before they wait for those good conditions to continue their journey northward if they are continuing that way. And then look at this, we have an even bigger night the following night, 329 million birds. Again, another great day. In Georgia and in Texas, most likely, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, a little bit slower out in the Mountain West. So again, brighter colors, more birds, 3 hours after sunset overhead. Again, if they're overhead, there's probably a good chance a good number of them are going to stop, but you never know. Keep an eye out for those storm fronts. That's going to knock down some of those birds and maybe make your outing a little bit better, as long as it's still not pouring on you as you go. Now, one thing, and I might mention this later, but I'll throw it out there now. One thing that's tricky about this map. So areas are really birdy, other areas are not. This is from it's a relative map. And so there are just more birds that migrate in the eastern United States than there are out west. There are lots and lots of birds that come up through Texas. And so it's very common to see Texas looking this color and poor, Idaho looking blues and purples. And if you live out there, you're going to go, oh, there are just never any birds migrating over Idaho. And that, of course, is not the case. But there are almost always less birds migrating over than there are in Texas. There are also less radar coverage out there because of the mountains. So it might be not quite as fine-tuned. But We're going to get into a kind of a statewide relative look at things later, but just because it's often darker in certain parts of the country doesn't mean that birds aren't moving over there. And it doesn't mean that it couldn't be a really exciting night for you and what you're used to if you live in those parts of the world, but it's not going to be as good as Florida or Texas or often Georgia, for example. So Birdcast is this platform that Cornell does. They can forecast 3 days in advance. I'm going to show you their website in a little bit. So now that you know about it, you can get on there, you can get a snapshot of what migration is going to be like that evening and see what things are going to look like in your neck of the woods and if it's an exciting time to get out or not. Let's see here. Here's just a little video. This kind of combines the last couple images I've shown you where we're going to see the sunset come across and you can see how the birds come once it gets dark, as well as the heat or intensity of migration, the traffic rate across our country. There goes sunset, and then boom, look at the wave of birds coming after it. The arrows are the wind direction or the movement of the birds. So this is, again, a spring night in late May, or mid-May, excuse me, where birds are just blasting through, especially further north where that's kind of the peak of migration there in the Midwest. Iowa is having a lot of birds fly over that night. Looks like, and you can kind of see the number of birds that have been flying over at any given time. So it starts kind of low. I'll do it one more time. So 36 million birds at 9, and then look in the middle of the night, we get up over 600 million birds in flight. So just phenomenal stuff that they can do using weather radar, as well as historical data on where and when birds show up. They're looking at the wind patterns, all sorts of different things like that to come up with a rough guess, or a pretty accurate guess, actually, of where and when birds are going to show up. Excuse me, go one more. Okay, so that's kind of how we use it for bird watching. And again, I'm going to show you all these if you stick with me. Birdcast has these great maps. They're going to show you the general intensity of migration over your neck of the woods, understanding that it's comparative. So the Southeast and Texas and parts of the Midwest are going to be better than other parts of the country. And again, you can use that if you're trying to pick. You got one weekend day to go out. The other day you got, things to do with the house. You can consider looking at Birdcast and having that guide your birding adventure the following day. So there is a downside to this, or there is a different application to this forecasting. As I mentioned at the beginning, birds use the setting sun and the stars as some of their navigational beacons when they're migrating. The problem is we really like to add a lot of fake stars out there. We have been providing a lot of light pollution and artificial light at night to our landscape, and that is impacting our birds in various ways. And one way is that it attracts birds, it disorients them. And so if you're a migrating Cape May warbler and you've been flying over the dark Gulf of Mexico and you're coming into a place like Atlanta, you are sucked in to this illuminated space. You are confused by it. You might give out nocturnal flight calls, which will attract your species mates, which is also a problem because you're pulling more birds into illuminated areas. And oftentimes, while that might make our birding at a local park good if you live in a city, those illuminated areas come with various threats. Some of them being the light themselves, if there's a strong beam of light, or more often it's the glass where a lot of this light is emitting from. And that leads to the third leading cause of bird death in our country, which is bird building collisions. So what we're going to be mainly talking about tonight is light. But we can't ignore what is connected to this lighting situation. So the best estimates we have are 365 million birds to 1 billion birds die annually in the United States due to collisions. And again, a big aspect of these collisions is that nocturnal light and how our nocturnal migrants are confused and attracted to it. I always kind of equate it to a moth to your front porch light that just bangs into it all summer long. Something similar and embedded within our birds. And we've seen some of these massive events, colleagues of mine up in New York City seeing a massive die-off of birds just this past year. 2 years ago, you can see this article written by our friends at National Audubon about a major event that happened in Philadelphia. There are stories down in Galveston, Texas of big collision events. And again, lighting and the behavior of nocturnal migrants is a big component on what's going on at these buildings. It's even become the kind of slogan or main thing for this year's World Migratory Bird Day, which is in mid-May. How can we dim the lights to help these birds that are doing these amazing journeys? We're looking at these maps. We want to get out and see them. How can we use this information to also protect birds and learn more about their conservation and what we can do at home to make their life a little bit easier? So to get more into this, as I said, lights at night attract and disorient birds. And one of the cases that people share a lot because it's so glaring is the tribute in lights in New York City. And this is a site where the Twin Towers once stood. And these lights are turned on during September 11th each fall to commemorate those that were lost. From a bird perspective, it's just a teeny bit unfortunate because that's when so many of them are doing their southbound journeys. And so this is a video from Kyle Horton, who's a researcher who works on this aeroecology, the kind of ecology of the lower skies of bird migration at night. Here's a video from the tribute in lights from years back. And so as this video starts, you're going to see these small dots, and they're going to look like moths or other insects. But these are actually birds. And these are birds that have become entrapped or ensnarled and confused by the tribute in lights. And they're on their southward journey, and they don't know what to do. They don't know what's going on, and they're hanging out this extreme light source. Now, luckily, light like this is uncommon across the landscape. Most light is not this strong. It's not directly pointed upwards, but it is something that is happening. And I share it more just to illustrate the point of what's going on. And so just to put some numbers behind this, at that site, when the lights are turned off, within a half square kilometer of that location, there were 500 birds. And then just 20 minutes later, there's almost 16,000 individuals over that same airspace because they're pulled in by those bright and confusing lights to birds. Now, again, I pointed out that's kind of an oddball. You know, the folks who manage that light work with Audubon and New York City Audubon and Cornell to turn them off, at least temporarily if bird numbers are too high. But it's not just those big cases. Our general increase in our artificial light at night and light pollution is growing. And if you think of birds right now that are doing this journey northward, Houston might be one of the first areas they hit. And the metro area is now larger than New Jersey. And look at all that light that these birds are going to be confused by and attracted to. And of course, we in Georgia are not any different than some of these other states. This is a image kind of showing where areas are brightest. So the bright whites and pinks are the most illuminated areas from artificial light, going down to the little bit of blue that you might be able to find, which are the darker areas. And of course, they're going to be around our urban centers where most of that is happening. But what is really interesting and also kind of unfortunate, the National Park Service has done some really amazing things to look at artificial light at their sites. And so this is Cumberland Island, a place that you would think is pretty dark, which it is. But if you look straight up when you're on Cumberland Island, it's 1.8 times brighter than it would be without artificial light being out there. If you look from the horizon and kind of scroll up, that number jumps from 1.8 times as bright to 4 times as bright. So this is kind of a little trippy, cool graphic just showing you of how the bright light on the horizon can impact the light that is perceived out on Cumberland Island. And just to give you an idea of other national parks or historic areas, Ocmulgee, if you're joining us from Macon, it's 9 times brighter. The night sky is at the Ocmulgee Mounds than it should be or would be without artificial light. Andersonville, which is a relatively remote location, it's 1 times brighter. Right here in Atlanta, where I'm sure most of you are coming from, the Island Ford unit of CRNRA is 18 times brighter than it ideally would be. Kennesaw, my backyard, 15 times. Now, if you see all that and you get depressed, go camping down at the Okefenokee and Stephen C. Foster, where it's almost pristine, 0.1 times brighter. So it's almost as dark as you'd want under ideal dark sky conditions. So there's so much more that I'm not going to get into about human health aspects of this and other considerations, but just from a bird perspective, just think about how much brighter these are, how these birds are going to be sucked into these areas, and the good and bad aspects of that. Here in Atlanta, just to put some more numbers behind it, this is from a study a couple years ago where it quantified kind of the number of birds that are overhead or likely to pass over an area and the artificial light at night. And they came up with a ranking system to see what cities potentially pose the most threats to migratory birds from a lighting aspect. Atlanta was the 9th most dangerous in the spring and 4th in the fall. And the difference is not because we get darker in the fall, but birds, many of them have an oval shaped migration, and we just have a lot more birds flying over in our fall migratory season. So I'm getting to more forecasting. I hope you stick with me. I know some of this might be repeat for a few of you. If not, I'm excited to talk to you about the things you can do to help birds at night. We have Lights Out Georgia, as do many other bird organizations across the country and others in the Audubon network. And the goal is, hey, take some steps to reduce your lighting at home or at work for a few months in the spring and a few months in the fall. This is kind of the all-encompassing migratory windows of mid-March to the end of May, mid-August into early November, to try to help as many birds as possible. And the ask that we're making of you is relatively easy. Turn off lights that you don't need, put your outdoor lights on motion sensors, make sure they're down shielded, draw the blinds or curtains if you have something on at night, use a timer. For commercial buildings, maybe use a strobe if you can instead of a straight beam light. And again, I keep saying this, it's so important because look at all these birds that are using Georgia all the time. So 50% of all our migrating birds are passing over in a few nights. Many of them are songbirds that are passing over our areas. 80% of our migratory birds are impacted by light pollution. And as I said, it disorients them and attracts them. And you can definitely make a difference by reducing your artificial light at night. Now, when I mentioned shading, or what are we talking about with lighting here? There's many different things. Again, just by turning it off when you can, you're saving energy, you're lowering your monthly bill, you're helping birds. Putting on a motion sensor, if you're really worried about someone walking by your garage, that's still going to catch them. We're not necessarily advocating for a pitch black downtown Atlanta, but there are appropriate ways to use our lighting, and there's ways to do so safely as well. There's a lot of this wrapped up into safety. Dark cities mean it's unsafe, and that's not necessarily true at all. But when I'm talking about shielding, this is what we're looking at. So in the left case, that light is very bad. A lot of it is emitting upward. It's going where it's not intending to go or where it benefits. Then you can have a partial cap there. That's at least cutting down on some of it, but not ideal. For the better scenario, again, more light going where it's actually supposed to be going. And in the best, fully shielded, it's going down to the sidewalk, to your driveway, to wherever it might be, and being used appropriately. In addition to that, you might have less light trespass or glare or light bouncing around. So there's many ways, many confusing ways that lighting is bouncing around, impacting our daily circles and our daily life, as well as these millions of birds that are migrating overhead. So I'm going to play a quick video here, again from Kyle, that I think is pretty helpful and will lead into our final thing about how we can use these forecasts for conservation.
As the sun sets, spring and fall nighttime skies fill with migratory birds. The exact numbers largely driven by time of year and atmospheric conditions. Yet, on some nights, the floodgates truly open, with enormous blooms of hundreds of millions of birds migrating, but visible only in data collected by weather surveillance radars. These sensors providing a unique lens into continental-scale migratory movements. In fact, during spring and fall, about 10 nights of some 100 nights in each season see more than 50% of migratory bird passage. These movements are not without their dangers. Hundreds of millions of birds die during migration annually. Mitigating aerial hazards such as light pollution and collisions with wind turbines or buildings is critical during these important nights. To help birds, and also to reduce human disruption, particularly from light pollution, we must protect the darkness of night skies. There are two broad strategies to do this. Determine historic periods of activity to protect the night skies, or dynamically predict the few important optimal nights when enormous numbers of migrants take flight. But predicting these optimal nights is challenging, or it used to be. Birdcast forecasts and lights out alerts offer a path toward dynamic action. During spring and fall, dynamic forecasts required fewer warning nights than using historic windows for capturing 50% of birds passing a given area. While best to eliminate as much light as possible for as much of the year as possible, our results highlight the value of near-term ecological forecasting and potential advantages of targeted dynamic mitigation strategies, especially in the face of increasing risks to migratory birds.
So a lot of that was a overview of what I've already tried to say today about migration and things like that. But the few things he said there at the end, which I thought hopefully you picked up on, was about the different ways that we can forecast and educate and plan for conservation actions that go with nocturnal migration and with our forecasting technology. So Kyle Horton and his team just mentioned, hey, there are, you can kind of approach lights out and light reduction from two ways. The traditional, which is what we're doing at Lights Out Georgia, where, hey, we're asking you to turn off lights for 3 months. But for some of you, you just aren't going to do that, and that's okay. There are some commercial properties that aren't going to do that, no matter how nicely we ask them. So what if we tell you, hey, there are 10 to 12 nights in Georgia each spring where 50% of all of our birds are going to fly overhead. Maybe those are the nights that we can target to at least help the most birds that are going over, the big nights where we can have the most impact. So with that in mind, and with Lights Out Georgia in mind, bird forecaster man Adam is back to show you the same forecast maps from earlier in the talk, but with a different spin. So now, instead of this continental or this, US-wide map for tonight's migration, we can take that same information and make it state specific. So these are lights out alerts, a lights alert system that we have worked with Kyle Horton and researchers at Colorado State and elsewhere across the country to put out there to send to those of you who are signed up for our Lights Out program, to send to those of you who follow us on social media, to know, hey, if you can't do it every night in spring, this is an extra important night. There are a lot of birds coming over. Consider doing it tonight if you can't do it any other night. And tonight's a pretty big night. So there are going to be 7.7 million birds. So how many was there? 258 over the entire United States. About 8 of those are going to pass over our state tonight. And so we have a 3-tiered system, or I guess a 4-tiered system. If the state's gray, that means, hey, no real movement tonight. And that would be, a December 12th type night. Then we have low, medium, and high. So tonight's, it's a good night. There's a lot moving over. It did kind of trigger that high warning in the southeast part of it, Atlanta over near Athens and north of Macon. So those areas specifically could be good. Again, we want you to turn off lights every night during migration, but if not, maybe you'll do them on the big night. So tonight, a pretty good movement of birds. Tomorrow, we're getting massive movement. We've almost doubled the number of birds that are moving over tonight. So tomorrow night, there'll be almost twice as many birds overhead as there is tonight. And so we are going to be issuing a lights out alert. Turn off your lights. If you didn't do it every night, if you're not already taking the lights out pledge, do it tomorrow night, because there are going to be massive amounts of birds flying over our state, along the Savannah River, going over Augusta, many over the Chattahoochee right here in Atlanta, all along the fall line. Almost the entire state is red. And then looking out to this weekend, another massive, massive night, the entire state, over 13 million birds flying over. This is a lights out alert. Now, when it is red, when we issue you an alert, that means it's one of those 10 nights or 12 nights, give or take, where 50% of the birds are moving over. So it's one of those upper threshold, upper limit nights, lots and lots of movement. This is a special night for spring migration. It's a special night for birds. The conditions are right. They have the tailwind. They're ready to go. Please, please, please consider turning off your lights for this night and maybe for every other night the remainder of the spring, if you're willing to do so. Alert, alert, alert. Another red light for our alert night. So that's kind of how we're using the lights out forecasting and those continental maps. It's now done to a statewide level. If you happen to live or travel elsewhere, you can find these maps for every state across the country. And can get out there and do what's right for birds at your job or at your home. Now, I can't touch on all this and not mention glass, at least quickly. It's easy for all of us to turn off our lights. I'm going to turn off my lights in those nights. I do it every night during migration. Lighting is problematic for birds. But the bigger thing is the glass. And it's the harder nut to crack, to be honest with you. Lighting saves money, saves energy. you can turn it off. There are a few barriers there, but it makes it a lot easier than dealing with the glass. These birds are coming in. They might not die at the light source. They will hit illuminated pieces of glass. They will get tired. They will go somewhere they're not supposed to. But the bigger component, and the one that I think is easy for us to not talk about, is that of glass. So these birds are coming in. When they come into our cities, they are confused by reflective glass. They don't understand reflections as being anything besides more habitat and another safe place where they can take a rest and get some food. They also can be confused by transparent glass. If it's parallel like this, they might think it's just a clear flyway, same as a glass corner. I always like to point out that people are poor with glass as well. And there's all sorts of other YouTube videos you can watch of people making a fool of themselves. We've just got really good at picking up on the architectural cues. We can't see the glass there. We just know it's there from the framing of the building. And if you notice in the right image, there's even a line of dots about eye level, probably to stop people from walking into it. So birds are not silly or stupid for not knowing glass is there and being confused by light. It's a newer threat to them. And I mention that because this is all part of our larger project, Safe Flight Georgia, where we are monitoring parts of Metro Atlanta and now the entire state. So if you are joining us from elsewhere, please get in touch with me. We want to know where the problem areas are, what birds are dying, what are areas of concern, develop a Lights Out program, which we did years ago, which is what we were talking about primarily today, and then take higher level action to make our state safer for birds. Through these findings, or through this monitoring, we have found thousands of birds around just Atlanta of 116 different species. So unsurprisingly, birds are not making it safely through Atlanta, and other parts of the state, we're sure. We're just still working on building out those data sets. If you do not want to be an active volunteer with us, or if this does not sound like fun to you, but if you do go out and happen to stumble across a bird that was maybe pulled in by nocturnal light or ran into a reflective piece of glass, you can report those findings at dBird. It's just a website. It's mobile friendly, dbird.org. And it's really easy. It says, when and where did you see the bird? It can auto pick up where you are in the time if you allow it to. You don't have to know anything about birds. You can identify the species if you know it, but you can put unknown, 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 and someone like me will figure it out for you later. If you're able to attach a photo, that's really helpful. And it goes into our larger data set, and we learn more about the bird collisions that are happening in our state. So as I've been talking about all this migration, these lights out alerts, all these things that can be done, you're probably thinking of high-rise buildings. But high-rise buildings only account for around 1 or 2% of those 350 million to 1 billion birds that are dying each year. Your homes, your workplaces, those office parks in the suburbs that are just completely mirrored are over 90% are those two, and 45% give or take at just your homes. So in addition to getting people to turn out lights, we're trying to make glass safer as well. We've done multiple building retrofits with nonprofits and other commercial buildings all around Metro Atlanta, with a few more coming up later this year. This is our first install we ever did at the Chattahoochee Nature Center a few years ago. And we're putting up film that break up that reflection to make it less confusing for birds. They see the dots, they realize, hey, this is not a clear flyway, I should go elsewhere. We're now partnering with architects on new construction to try to get bird safe buildings constructed, like the Candida building on Georgia Tech's campus, which uses this ceramic frit pattern in their glass. Which again will help deter birds from running into that and confusing it for a clear flyway. But at home, there are many things you can do. Keep up your insect screens or exterior shutters. There are different products and films and cords and things you can dangle. They can be very cheap. They don't have to adhere to your glass. You can do it at home. It's not going to take away from your beautiful backyard view. There's lots you can do. If you have kids or grandkids, let them dirty up the windows or paint them or do something fun for the couple weeks in April and May or September and October when things are extra crazy from a migration standpoint. And so real quickly, before we go onto the website, poke around and answer some questions. This is my ask of you, since you've stayed with me this time and heard me talk about all these lights and collisions and forecasting. Please take the Lights Out Georgia Pledge. We would love to have you on board. Homeowners, residential properties, commercial properties, your job, wherever you can. Please consider doing what's right by reducing lighting for birds and for your own benefit. If you can't do that, or in addition to that, look for our alerts. Again, we're going to have an alert for at least tomorrow and the following night, maybe even into Sunday or this weekend. Turn off your lights on those nights if those are the only ones you can do it. consider making your home safer for birds with films or other things. Help us monitor. If you're really jazzed about this and want to learn more, we always need people all across the state to get out and look for birds that have run into buildings or been confused by light or in a sketchy situation. And next time you go on birding from a more positive standpoint, think about these forecasts and how you can get out there and make the most of your few hours out and about. Before I condense or can close this PowerPoint, thank you very much. There's my contact info. It's also on our website at georgiaaudubon.org. I'm happy to answer any questions or do whatever in regards to collisions or lighting, and I'm your man for that. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to share again. Dottie, if there are any questions, you can feel free to start firing them at me. I'm happy to multitask and do a few things at the same time, so please let me know. All right, so here's the website. Excuse me. Here is Birdcast. Birdcast.info is the main site. It's a Cornell initiative partnering with a few different universities, Colorado State, I mentioned earlier, and Kyle Horton and his team, UMass Amherst. And if you go here, you can find these maps. And here's how they're displayed for the upcoming 3 nights. Pretty much the next morning, they will have the new 3 nights ready to go, but you can see what's going on from a continental aspect. Now, we timed this webinar and this Facebook event perfect because just in the past week, they launched this migration dashboard. And this is the coolest thing that you have seen in a long time. So it's taking that amazing, unbelievable technology that they already have and getting even more fine-tuned to it. So with this dashboard, you can now search. So instead of looking at the whole country and you're trying to tell, is South Georgia good or only North Georgia? And yeah, that looks fine for Bartow County, but what's happening over here in Hall County? I don't know what's going on. You can now search down to the county level. So let's do Fulton, right in the heart of Atlanta here. We can zoom in and look at this amazing granular detail it can tell us. It's saying that in Fulton County last night, there was an estimated 3,200 birds that crossed over. At peak migration, 1,600 birds were in flight at a time. You can see migration so far, so the ups and downs of their nightly averages. A bird, you can see we're kind of at the very beginning of the peak for spring migration. You can come down for the total cumulative number of birds that are expected to cross Fulton County during the entire spring season. So we're just a little bit below, which means we're gonna probably shoot up here. It has felt a little slow in migration in Atlanta and in other parts of the state. It's about to blast off, it looks like. On some nights, you can look at flight speed and direction or altitude of birds, or you can check this out in the middle of the night to see how things are going. And what's really neat is you can look at the likely species that are moving over on that night. So if you have not seen a Cape May warbler, you can see, wow, this is a great time for them to come over. And it looks like in the first couple of weeks of May, you can find them as well. If you click on that, it'll take you to their eBird page. So if you are an eBird user, you can, even if you're not, you can check all this stuff out and you can consider joining. You can look at the different plumages, which is really important for Cape May warbler because they can be quite tricky if they're kind of drab females. You can listen to their very high-pitched song if you want and learn more about these birds and the amazing geographic area. So these birds that are coming over Fulton County tonight, again, they're coming off of Hispaniola, they're coming off of Puerto Rico, they're passing through our state and they're going up to Canada to nest where there's lots of spruce and other conifers. So this is a really cool, brand new tool. You can go back in history and look, well, hey, what was it like on my birthday? My birthday was April 5th. Fulton County, not much, 25,000. Actually, that's not bad, but it's not the mega nights that might be coming up. Only 25,000 birds, more than last night. But last night around here, if you're in Atlanta, there were some clouds, there was some rain, so that kept migration low. So again, April 5th, 25,000 birds. Last night, only 3. It was a slow night. But again, the weather would indicate that. The front has cleared. Tomorrow, we're starting to get those winds, or tonight, excuse me, birds are going to start moving through. So this new dashboard will tell you all sorts of cool things about what birds are passing through, how many, how much migration has occurred. Ooh, look at that. Glenn County was a big one last night. The coast was alive with bird migration. So 3,000 species in Atlanta and 709,000 down on the coast. So if you're joining us from the Golden Isles, you're kicking our butt right now on all this excitement. And look, even some different species, shorebirds that are passing over, the last wave of ruby-crowned kinglets before they depart until the fall months. So again, different assemblages of species, different amounts. It makes sense. The weather patterns are different down there. They might have been able to pass through before that storm front headed their way. So this is a different way you can use this migration technology. And then one final thing, if you scroll down, so again, this is Birdcast. Migration Dashboard is a new tool that I've been playing with for like 2 days. It's like the coolest thing ever. Here are the countrywide maps you can play with. And then down here, you can look at local alerts, which is very similar to what we're doing. Let's see here. How about old Bacon County, old Baconton, Georgia, wherever that is? Sure. Sorry if you're from Baconton, I don't know where that is. It's a medium night tonight, so they can tell you there's no migration alert tonight, which this matches perfectly what I showed you on those statewide maps. It's a medium night for most of the state, and then high and high are coming on the following nights. But if you recall, if you've been with me this whole time, there was that little hot spot of hot migration over southeastern Atlanta. And sure enough, look, boom, it's a high night. So it's only a medium night for the state of Georgia, but for Atlanta, this is going to be one of those top 10 nights of migration all spring. 3 in a row. Big, big, big movement. Thousands and thousands of birds over Atlanta in the next couple of nights. Millions and millions, tens of millions over our state. So I'm here. I got questions. I see there's some stuff in the chat. I'll look at those. Dottie, feed me, whatever. I appreciate you all spending some time with me to hear about our Project Safe Flight Georgia and our Lights Out program. And then just kind of more broadly, the amazing ways that NextRad radar and ornithologists can use radar system to quantify bird migration, predict migration, and then take action to try to implement new conservation tools and ways to connect with the folks out there who didn't know that birds are migrating at night and some of the perils that they face. So thank you so much.
Adam,
I'm here for questions. Yes.
Quick question for you. When you talk about the number of birds estimated to migrate over, those are different than the birds that are already in the city, correct? Or in the area?
Yeah, most likely, but some of those could be taking off, nearby, just south, and then they would add to that number. So they aren't all necessarily from further away, but they probably are, because that, at least from the larger number, if I go back here, right here, this is from 3 hours after sunset. And most birds are leaving within the first couple hours after the sun goes down. So most of the birds that are going to be flying 3 hours have come from places further south in the spring and further north in the fall. So yes, likely they are new birds that are coming over. But in addition, so again, using these maps or thinking about this big wave of birds that we're having tomorrow night throughout most of the state, it indicates not only are we getting new birds coming, but our birds might be departing as well. So it could be a mix, but because that snapshot is in later in the night, most of those birds are going to be new birds passing over, and our birds are not included. They're gone. They're leaving.
Esther asks if we could use the Birdsong ID app to identify the birds that are flying overhead at night.
So I thought about I thought about including this in the talk, and I realized I already had too much stuff, so I didn't. But one really cool thing, if you want to be a full-on bird nerd like me, is what people call nocturnal flight calls. And so it's becoming more popular to put out a speaker system or something to take recordings of birds flying overhead, because some species do give distinctive call notes. And so in theory, yes, if you had Merlin open and you were standing outside with your phone, it might be able to pick up some of those calls. The thrushes, for example, Veery, gray-cheeked Swainsons, they all give distinctive flight calls. And so I've been birding with friends of mine and gone to quiet places and listened for those birds in the middle of the night on big days, and we can pick them up on occasion. Indigo buntings have a very unique call, Dick Sissels. So yes, I think it's possible that Merlin could pick up some of those. And then beyond that, people more and more are putting out just little recorders in a bucket or things in their backyard to record that sound and try to identify them after the fact. I'd hope to do that this spring and was too slow in getting that together. But yeah, I suspect it could work. The Merlin sound app is phenomenal. It's not perfect, so it definitely could give you some wonky results, but I would bet there's a chance it could identify a number of species.
Anybody else have any questions
Yeah.
they'd like to
Anything
add?
else? Anything about migration? Like I said, it's a great time just to get out. Whether you're using the forecasting or not, again, please consider reducing your lights. It really does help birds. And then after you do that, think about how you can make your windows safer. Yeah, the Merlin app is a really great tool for.
I just dropped the link and the link to the website in the chat box.
Great. It's really good. It kind of started to help you walk through the identification by asking you questions on how big a bird is and what color was it and what was it doing. That's great. It can identify a bird pretty accurately from a photo, and now it can identify most birds that are singing. And then even if you travel internationally, Merlin has packs for different regions and countries that you can use as almost a digital field guide on your phone instead of lugging around a big book with you. So phenomenal stuff that Cornell, a lot of it's being driven by Cornell, lots of great work in the Audubon network, National Audubon, and many of the chapters and state offices and places like us, the American Bird Conservancy. So really cool stuff, and lots of ways to try to help our birds, because as many of us know, they're getting hit pretty hard, and lighting is an easy way we can help them. Just turn off your light, save some energy, lower your monthly bill, and listen for those night calls overhead. All right.
Mark would like to know when you're making your debut on the Weather Channel.
On the Weather Channel, man. I thought about doing one of these. The guy who did this earlier out in Colorado last year, he did like just a 15-minute like alert. And he came in. And I was going to do that, and I even thought about going and getting a blazer on and everything, but it was just too busy of a day, Mark, and I didn't have a chance to get to it. But I'm ready. I thought about having my Zoom backdrop. I was going to play with something, and I had great intentions. It was just all the other bird stuff got in the way today, but I appreciate your endorsement.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us this evening, and this has been recorded, and we'll put it up on our YouTube channel, and you can also go to Facebook and watch it on Facebook. The video will be saved there because this has been live streamed to Facebook. Adam, do you have anything else to add? Oh, and please go sign our Lights Out alert, our Lights Out pledge. I put a link in the chat box, and you can sign that, and we'll be sending you emails on nights of peak migration to remind you to turn your lights out.
No, I think that's it, Dottie. That's great. Yeah, check those out. Consider the pledge. It's a pretty easy and reasonable thing to do, and enjoy it. The next 3 weeks are going to be some of the most exciting on the bird calendar, and it's hard to not look at some of these birds and just be blown away that hummingbird just doubled its weight and flew across the Gulf of Mexico, and it shows your backyard. So just enjoy it, get outside, and thank you so much.